All right. It is August 7th. Nice to come to you in on a Wednesday in the middle of the week here. That's good. Well, it's been a while. I haven't been on in several weeks, and so there's been several things that have happened that I think are opportunities to see things from a biblical perspective. Well, we're not going to choose too many, but one is the Olympics opening, Mockery of the Lord's Supper. So, filth and sacrilege in the Olympics. That's what it is. Filth and sacrilege. And you got to be careful what you say here on YouTube because they will shut you down. They removed one of my videos before talking about transgenders. They took it down. That was well over a year ago. I added it to my Facebook, but they did take it down. And listen, you have to be careful because they will shut your video down. They will shut your channel down. They give you 3 strikes. Now, they didn't give me a strike, give me a warning. But nevertheless, okay, so filth and sacrilege at the Olympics. We all saw what was going on. And it was a mockery of the Lord's Supper. And actually, it was a mockery of the version that most people know of the Lord's Supper, which is the Leonardo da Vinci painting, The Last Supper. And so that's what they did. They had a near-naked man in blue or purple. I'm colorblind. I don't know which is which. I assume blue. Right? There, and it was just a weird thing. Now, I actually don't watch the Olympics. I've never watched the Olympics. Now, that's just me. A lot of people like the Olympics. I'm not a big sports guy in general, but I do like some sports, but not necessarily the Olympics. So, in Paris, the opening ceremony of the Olympics had a whole group of people that were transgender and who knows what else, doing a mock-up of the Leonardo da Vinci Last Supper version of the Lord's Supper. Now, you can call it the Last Supper, that's fine. A lot of people do. I call it the Lord's Supper. I think that's what most people that are familiar with it from the Bible call it, the Lord's Supper or communion. I'm not against calling it the Last Supper, but that's really the painting thing. But so that's what it was. They did a whole mockery of it. And so we'll take the opportunity to look at what the Lord's Supper actually is, and then if we have time, I'm going to look at something about Israel, just because of a passing comment that I heard over the week. So, filth and sacrilege. Now, I say filth because there was a near, and I didn't actually see it, but I've seen, you see the news stuff, right? You see the news clips and whatnot. But a near-naked man dressed in or colored in blue or purple, I can't remember which. I couldn't tell from my own eyes. It looks the same to me. I am colorblind. It's that color too that always comes up. When I was in preschool, I remember when I first realized I was colorblind, the teacher in preschool told us to draw blue ghosts. So I got out my blue crayon, I colored this ghost that she gave us blue. And then she had the whole class show off their ghosts, right? And unbeknown to me, it was I colored mine purple, and all the kids laughed. I realized at that point that I wasn't seeing colors the same way everybody else. But so this is what you had. And first of all, taking away the fact that this was a mockery of something sacred and holy, it's just ignorant, shallow-minded, meaningless. It is absurd, just by the very nature of it anyway. To have people up there, some of which are people that claim to be a gender that they're not, living in fantasy land and wanting everybody else to buy into fantasy land, and then having a man wearing next to nothing, all colored up. All of this it's just stupid. It's absurd. It has no meaning anyway. Besides the fact that it's a mockery of something sacred, there's no art to it. A man wearing next to nothing, dressed in all blue or purple, it has no value, it has no art, it has no imagination anyway. It's just the silliest thing that a bunch of people can do who just want to promote something, and that's all it is. It's just an effort to spread and promote this cultural rot that they are trying to promote, over there in Paris. And so just taking away the Lord's Supper aspect of this, first, it's just absurd. It's not artistic. It's not imaginative. It's something that a bunch of very rebellious, uneducated 3-year-olds would do. I say uneducated, but even your normal 3-year-olds wouldn't do that. They don't think of that in those terms. But if they're highly uneducated and rebellious, it's the mentality, in other words. You take an adult who's got a lot of, who's living in fantasy land, trying to promote absurd messages and concept with the mentality of a 3-year-old, and that's what they do. Now they came, and afterwards, I was almost going to play this clip, but I forget her name, Ann something. One of the spokesmen or spokeswoman for the Paris Olympics. She said, because there was a little bit of backlash, and that's somewhat surprising, but it won't matter much. I mean, it ain't going to affect much. It's not enough of a backlash. But so this Ann lady comes out and apologized afterwards. Now, what she said, if you go and you watch the clips of the apology, because there was more than expected backlash by a lot of those in the Christian communities and otherwise, and they did lose some money, some sponsors. But this, after somewhat of a backlash, she came out and said, well, we did not mean to offend anybody or disrespect any religion. If we did, we're sorry. Well, first of all, let's think about that for a second. It doesn't matter. Let me say it like this. I will accept that they likely didn't go in this with the intention to disrespect. They probably weren't thinking, I want to go in there and I want to disrespect Christians. I want to disrespect Christ and the Last Supper. I want to disrespect Christianity. I'm sure they didn't go in there thinking that. They went in there wanting to promote a message without caring in the slightest about Christianity and Jesus. So it's not like they went in there with the agenda to disrespect. They just went in there without any respect and without any regard. And that's what came through. So yes, I'm sure they didn't have the plan to disrespect Christianity. They simply just didn't have any care for it or respect for it and do not care about it in the slightest. They do not consider Jesus or the Lord's Supper holy in the slightest, of course. Why would they? And they don't even care to think about it. So no, they didn't go in there to disrespect. They just went in there with disrespect. And second, she said, we didn't mean to offend any religion. Well, I don't know if she means denominations, like individually, but it's not like this is going to offend Muslims, or that's not what people would perceive. It's not like this was going to offend Buddhists. Yeah, it was Christianity. People don't care about Christianity. The secular world doesn't care about Christianity. And there's a couple of reasons why that is. Number one is because the culture and society allows Christianity to be an easy target because it's the main enemy and it criticizes it often. Jesus is much more made fun of and put into satire than Muhammad or anybody else. And it's just an easy target because society has made it a target for so long. But also, another reason is because they just don't. Islam is just not much of an interest by way of getting it out of the way. In other words, Islam doesn't. There's nothing in Islam that provides much of a threat for their agenda. Let's take the Western world here. Christianity and its values were the foundation of the American nation. That's what it was built upon. I mean, whether everybody in the founding time was a Christian or not, that's the fact, that the ethics of Christianity were the foundation of it, and there was a lot of respect for it. And the moral values of Christianity is what has to get out of the way for a lot of the agenda of cultural rot that is spreading to flourish. Islam, if society knows much about it at all, it knows it's, there's some things they don't like. They don't like women being forced to wear burqas or headdresses or cover their faces. They know it for, praying 5 times perhaps. And they know it whether the Quran supports it or not. It's a different discussion. They know it for bombing and terrorism. But a lot of the moral fabric that is in the way of the culture of the liberal agenda. When I say liberal, yes, this is the liberal politicians and the liberal side of the political system of our culture, but just liberal-minded people in general. It's those ethics of Christianity that have to get out of the way. Now, Islam, of course, doesn't support transgenderism. Islam, of course, doesn't buy into all that, but they're just, it's not known for its moral integrity. I mean, whether it has it or not, the issue is that really is seen in Christianity by the secular society. So Zachary Stevens, you are in Paris. He says, I am here where it happened. We are passing out Bibles with the church group. Okay. Now, it's interesting that, you're in Paris. So now I got to ask, if you are in Paris, Zach, and thanks for tuning in too, by the way, I'd like to know, what was it like being there at the time? What was the backlash like there? I mean, we know what the backlash was somewhat here in the Western world, and we know advertisers pulled out somewhat. But I'm kind of curious, since you are there, what was it like being there? What did you see locally and in the area? That'd be interesting to me. But in the meantime, let me say this. So I said that Christianity is an easy target, and it really is. But now here's the next thing. Concerning the Lord's Supper. Now let's get to that issue. Yes, it has always been the tendency of highly degraded cultures and people to take that which is considered holy and profane it, which simply means taking something that is profane and bringing it down into a debased level. And they've been doing this with marriage, of course, but they have marriage, they got an interest in promoting their agenda. The Lord's Supper, not so much. It's the opportunity, though, to take something that is considered holy and degrade it. Take something holy and make a mockery of it. Turn it into something absurd and immoral. That's what they were doing. And it's always been a tendency. When... you remember the story, if you know religious history and church history, even though this goes back to Israel history, of Antiochus Epiphanes sacrificing a pig in the temple of Jerusalem. A pig, that's the idea. So taking something that's considered holy is a way in which, when they're spreading their agenda and for enemies of a particular holy movement, in this case Christianity, it's their way of really showing their disdain. It's a way of them showing their disdain. So now I was commenting on what the lady said, the spokesman, who said we didn't go in there with an interest in disrespecting any religion. Well, I'm sure she may not have, and if I believe what she said, I repeat the comments that I already made, that you may not have. I'm sure that you didn't. I mean, a lot of the organizers, I'm sure, didn't. But a lot of people, no doubt, would have. A lot of the people that were there, a lot of the people that were involved, a lot of the people involved in the ceremony itself, maybe not the organizers, but the people that were there participating in it, who knew about the Lord's Supper and know about all that very well, yeah, they wanted to show their disregard of it. Zachary Stevens says, I wasn't where the ceremony was. We were outside, but there was some disdain. But overall, no big deal. There are several ministries here ministering to the people. Well, I appreciate that. I appreciate some effort there. Yeah, well, so, so that's what... I say there wasn't enough of a backlash. I'm surprised even that there was, but, not much. They'll go on and keep doing the things that they do. But now I want to take the opportunity from a biblical perspective to say some things about the Lord's Supper, and I want to look at a passage. Now here's why, because this provides an opportunity. In my experience, well, I don't know that it's the case that most, but I would say many, of the Christian world, if they know the Lord's Supper at all, they probably do know it from the Last Supper painting by Leonardo da Vinci. And in my experience, which may not be universal, but it's probably pretty close. My experience says that most of Christianity knows very little about the Lord's Supper, and the celebrations that relate to Jesus that most of Christianity are well aware of is Christmas and Easter, which are not even biblical holidays. I mean, in the sense that they don't arrive from the Bible. Of course, the concept. So with Christmas, of course, it's becoming more. It's celebrated even by the secular society, but the religious community that celebrates Christmas as a religious observance, well, of course, they know it as the birth of Christ, and I think everybody understands. I mean, most people that have looked into it know that that's not really established as the birth of Christ. Nobody knows when his birth was, because the Bible doesn't tell us. But nevertheless, so observing Christmas as an observance of his birth and setting aside the issue of, the good or bad about Christmas, its origins and all that, other than, of course, it doesn't derive from the Bible. The Bible doesn't talk about Jesus, the date of his birth, nor the celebration thereof. But I'm not trying to make an issue out of whether it's a sin or not to observe Christmas and all those discussions. Easter, those are separate discussions because I want to keep on the point I'm making. The same with Easter. Now, the Easter is a celebration of the resurrection. But there isn't such a celebration really in the Bible. Easter, of course, comes afterwards in history. So does Christmas. Easter supposedly as the celebration of his resurrection. But here's what I'm saying. In the Bible, the significant memorial / celebration, and it is in a certain respect a celebration as well. It's like a celebration and a funeral almost. But the Lord's Supper is repeated several times throughout the New Testament as something that Christ instituted and wanted to be observed as a memorial of his death and of his death. That's repeated in 3 of the Gospels, and it's talked about in several places by Paul. So it has significant place in the New Testament, something Jesus specifically wanted to institute. Now, Christmas and Easter, say what you will about whether they should be observed. There's all kinds of debates on Christmas and Easter, and I just want to keep that debate separate from my point. So let's assume for the sake of discussion that celebrating Christmas, Easter, it's not anti-biblical, but it's simply non-biblical. Now, here's the point I'm wanting to make. And yet the one that is biblical, which is the Lord's Supper, is the one that people know the least about. Now, there's something wrong with that. There's no doubt about it. So, people well know Christmas. They know it as the birth of Christ. Easter, celebration of the resurrection. And it's great that we think about his resurrection. Now, Easter, once again, I'm trying to keep out of the discussion of Easter eggs, rabbits, and all that, which, what in the world does that have to do with the resurrection? But nevertheless, separate discussion. The fact of the matter is, the celebration concerning Christ that you will find in the New Testament is the Lord's Supper, and that's the one nobody knows about. Well, that's a hyperbole. Plenty of people do, but in general, it's known the least. It's known the least. Most people have not thought about it in the least. Whatever church there may be that actually observes it, and a lot of them don't, but whatever church actually observes the Lord's Supper, the common, your average churchgoer there, if you asked them, probably wouldn't even know when it happens. When do they observe it? Well, I'm not quite sure. And so what I'm saying is this. Why is it that there's such an ignorance, really, on the one celebration and memorial that relates to Jesus in the New Testament that is actually stated about? There's little known about that. Why is that? And most likely because it doesn't bring all the glamour and excitement that these others do. Well, no doubt. I mean, that's why Easter is full of things that attract children, for one thing. And say what you want about Easter. I mean, a lot of people say, well, it's got pagan origins. All right, well, set apart that discussion. Here's a fact. You're not doing anything in regard to the resurrection when you're engaged in hiding eggs, coloring eggs, the Easter bunny and all this. Doesn't do anything for Jesus and his resurrection. Doesn't benefit it at all. Doesn't attribute to it at all. If you want to claim that this is a celebration of his resurrection, get rid of the stuff that has nothing to do with it. But that stuff attracts the children. Well, of course, everybody loves Christmas, of course. There's gifts and lots of other things that attract children, and these things are much more exciting. Lord's Supper is really just about Jesus. And because let me tell you, as a kid, and when it comes to Christmas, when I was young, I loved Christmas. And I tell you why. It wasn't because of Jesus. My grandpa, when it came on Christmas Eve, he would sit the family down. At some point during the eating and the get together there, at some point during the evening, he would get everybody down around, the whole family, large family, and he would read the story about the birth of Christ. I hated that moment. I wanted to get to the gifts, and what I thought of when it came to Christmas was Santa Claus. So in all of that I'm simply saying Jesus gets lost in these holidays. And I believe that the reason the Lord's Supper is just not as well known, cared about, is just because it's merely about, there's little to it that attracts you other than if you just want to remember Jesus. But that shouldn't be. So I just wanted to take the opportunity to see something about the Lord's Supper. Now, we could go to Matthew, Mark, or Luke, but some things Paul here says I think will do well for us. So whatever you think about Christmas and Easter, if you call yourself a Christian, you need to be very concerned, even more so, with the actual memorial that Jesus cared enough to institute. And it's repeated 3 times even, and several times by Paul, and this, for the most case, right here in 1 Corinthians 11. So what I'm wanting to do is take something and learn something biblical from this. All right, so 1 Corinthians 11. Paul writing to the church at Corinth, a church that he founded. There were some problems here as regard to the Lord's Supper, and I want to read and learn. And Chris Lucas says, I would say Daniel 8 and the prophecy of Antiochus Epiphanes persecuting the Jews is probably one of the best proofs in the entire Bible that it's a prophetic book of God. Lots of good stuff in Daniel by way of prophecy. Christopher Lampman says, I think Ayatollah in Iran was upset by the opening ceremony too, and he's Muslim. Well, I believe so because Muslims don't. One thing Muslims certainly don't care or support is all this transgenderism and stuff like that. There's no doubt about it. They wouldn't be too pleased by it. Okay, now in verse 17 is when Paul actually shifts to the topic of their observance of the Lord's Supper. Now, I talked about how little is, or too little at least, is known about the Lord's Supper. Now, of course, when it comes to Catholicism, let me say this. Now, I disagree with much of how Catholics view the Lord's Supper and what they say about it, and I think it's very important disagreements. I will be fair where I can. At least they know about it. At least they know about it. I mean, Protestants need to at least be educated more in the Lord's Supper. So, now the whole Catholicism, Mass thing is a whole debate in itself. I've talked about what I believe about transubstantiation and all that, but that's neither here nor there for the moment. Okay, so he says this. Well, let me set up this context, and this is why it's important. This is why I talked about what I talked about. So, as Christians, we need to have a care about the Lord's Supper. And I also mentioned how one of the reasons I think it's just not as successful as these other holidays is because it's really just about Jesus. And it's why Easter and all that incorporates so much else, because it's make it exciting and mainstream and all that. But as Christians, we need to have a concern and care about the Lord's Supper, and it does need to remain about Him. And this is especially true with the Lord's Supper. And when it comes to the Corinthians, they had lost sight of what this was really about. Now, there's a perception in this rebuke by Paul in Corinthians. There's a perception that this is about, they were abusing the form, like how it was being observed in the sense of the items. They weren't following it ritualistically correctly. That's not what this is about. Paul doesn't have anything to say about the form in which they kept it. He has something to say about the spirit in which they kept it. And I think things get lost when we don't get that. All right, so he says, "But in giving you this command, I don't praise you that you come together not for the better, but for the worse. For first of all, when you come together in the assembly, I hear that divisions exist among you, and I partly believe it." So Paul says first, now this isn't the context of the Lord's Supper, that's going to become clear. But he says, when you come together, you do more harm than you do good. When you come together as an assembly, you do more harm than you do good. And then he says, I hear that divisions exist among you, and I partly believe it. But now, in the first chapter, Paul had already talked about the divisions in the church, and they were well established, and he condemned them for it. So why would he here say, I hear that there are divisions, and I partly believe it, when he had spent chapters earlier acknowledging that they had divisions and rebuking them for it, and speaking specifically? Well, this is a different type of division that he's talking about. The divisions in the first parts of the chapter were divisions of mentality, different groups at odds with different groups, forming factions concerning who baptized them and all that. Here he's talking about, evidently, it has to be some other type of division. And when he speaks about them assembling, it must be physical divisions. That's the difference. The divisions that were so concrete and well known and rebuked in the first chapters, several chapters, were about divisions of their mentality and their beliefs, and divisions between brethren as far as, these factitious spirits forming different groups. I am of Paul, I am of Peter, I am of Apollos. And there was oppositions between these factions. But here it seems to be a division of assembly. And what I'm saying is they're coming together. It's not just the fact that there's division, a physical division, but the reason the divisions are occurring. I mean, the divisions are the symptoms of what he's saying here. He's saying, for there must also be factions among you, that those who are proved may be revealed among you. Now, he seems to be speaking sarcastically there, saying, okay, well, it's good that there are divisions, so that the ones that are actually doing the right thing can be known. Of course, division isn't always condemned in Scripture, right? Division among the good, when someone sows division among brethren and causes problems, that's a bad thing. But when you cause a division between the good and away from the bad, that's not a bad thing. Jesus caused division in that regard. But nevertheless, he says in verse 20, when therefore you assemble yourselves together, it is not possible to eat the Lord's Supper. Now, I know, I left myself in the World English Bible. Let me go to Legacy Standard. Okay. Verse 20 again, therefore, when you meet together in the same place, it is not to eat the Lord's Supper. For in your eating, each one takes his own supper first, and one is hungry, and another is drunk. Okay, so what does he mean when he says it is not to eat the Lord's Supper? Now, some have falsely concluded, well, you see, it shouldn't be called the Lord's Supper. That's what Paul says. No, that's not what he means. Now, what he means, or what he says actually, is that the Lord's Supper is contrasted with each one's own supper. In other words, he's saying, when you come together, each one is taking his own supper. He's making it about himself, in other words. So the Corinthians are coming together. And instead of observing this meal that is centered on the Lord and belongs to the Lord, they end up being selfish with the food, as we see. And it's about their supper. It's not the Lord's Supper anymore. It's theirs. This is about what they're doing. This is about them getting their food. This is about them self-centered on satisfying themselves. So that instead of the supper being the Lord's, now it becomes each one's. That's why he says it's not to eat the Lord's Supper, because he's saying it's not what you're doing anymore. Your purpose isn't to observe the Lord's Supper, it's to observe your supper. Because one is hungry and another's drunk. So when he says one is hungry, he means you're coming together and some are eating, and you're so concerned about eating your own food, you don't even have regard for others who may not have food. Now, we don't know exactly what the situation was. It seemed that the poorest among them probably weren't able to bring food, at least the degree that the more wealthier did. And it seemed like the wealthy got together and were eating, and there were some getting there late, perhaps, because travel wasn't what it was in modern times. It was much more difficult, and all the food was eaten up. Or this faction over here that assembled, and you have these group over here, and they were eating their own food, and because of the division, they were eating with themselves, and these people over here, and these people over here, that some came there and didn't have food, or as much to share in, and they were left hungry. They came together to eat a meal together, and because of the selfishness of so many, there wasn't food being passed around. And you can kind of see how that would be with these little divisive groups assembling by themselves, because they had disregard for others who didn't have the food. Or at least when they got there expecting that there would be food, it was all eaten. Or felt ostracized by not being welcome into some of the groups that had the food. And so one is hungry. One is hungry, meaning he didn't have the food that everybody else did, because you're getting there and you're getting with the people that you like, and you're eating up this food that you brought for the Lord's Supper. And then another is drunk. One is left hungry, others well satisfied. So you see, this isn't the Lord's Supper anymore. And this relates to what I said earlier. As Christians, whatever you think of Christmas and Easter, the Lord's Supper was such a significant ordinance instituted by Jesus Christ that Paul gets in there to rebuke them for losing sight of it when they were observing it. They were turning it into something, and this relates full circle now back to what we were doing. They were taking something holy and making it so common. That's what sacrilege is. Now, when the pagans do it, and when the unbelievers and the people that can't even figure out what a woman is and what a man is, when these people are doing it, God isn't shocked or surprised. Doesn't make it not important. Doesn't make it sinful. But foolish people are going to do foolish things. He's really concerned when Christians lose sight of it. But here they are, taking something holy and making it unworthy of its own name. They're taking a supper that's supposed to be about the Lord, and they're making it about themselves. That's what he means when he says, you're not coming together to eat the Lord's Supper. That's not what you have in mind. You come together to eat your own food and have a great old time. So, Verse 20, therefore when you meet together in the same place, it is not to eat the Lord's Supper. Well, I don't know if I cleared that up for you. But it's a contrast. There's contrasting statements. There is eating the Lord's Supper in contrast or juxtaposed to what they were doing, which is eating their own supper. It's Lord's Supper versus their own supper. When they were coming together for their own satisfaction and concerned about themselves and the enjoyment merely of eating, so much so that they're leaving others hungry, they've made the supper their own. It's a supper that is about them. It's no longer a supper about the Lord, and so it's not the Lord's Supper that they're eating their own supper. And that's why he explains it. One is hungry and another is drunk. You've made the supper your own instead of the Lord's. But the very fact that he goes on to give what the Lord instructed concerning this memorial means that this is what they, in pretense, were doing. This is what it should have been, what it was supposed to be. This is what they were saying that it was. This is what they were supposedly doing. But Paul is saying, but it isn't. You're not assembling for the Lord's Supper. But we don't get ahead of ourselves here. He says, do you not have houses in which to eat and drink? Or do you despise the church of God and shame those who have nothing? What shall I say to you? Shall I praise you? In this I will not praise you. What does he mean for do you not have houses to eat and drink in? I just want to be careful not to read things in that are not there. Now, for the longest time, I thought I used this text to say it's wrong to, as a church, eat any kind of meal together. You're supposed to eat, or as a church, you're supposed to eat in secular meals or fellowship meals. Don't do it as a church. But that's not his point. Or some people say, well, so you're not supposed to eat the Lord's Supper at all for the sake of enjoying it or satisfy hunger. Well, certainly you're not supposed to be doing it merely for that. That's what they were doing. But Paul is not saying you cannot eat the Lord's Supper or you cannot have... His point is not about typical meals or common meals, whether the church can come together for that at all. But I thought it was. And people say, well, he says right there, you have houses to eat and drink in. The only meal the church is supposed to eat together is the Lord's Supper. That's not his point. When he says, do you not have houses to eat and drink in, he says it because of what he just said. The reason he says it is because of what just preceded it. They were coming together for the sake of enjoyment merely, and they were making it about eating and drinking and leaving others hungry. And what he's saying is, if that's your main concern, if eating and drinking is your main concern, that is so much that you're behaving like this, do that at home. So that at least when you come together in the assembly, you're not going to be so interested in eating up all the food. You're not going to be so focused on the food and drink. It'll be a little easier for you to leave some for others, and it'll be a little easier for you to have your mind on the Lord instead of just satisfying yourself. If that's what you want to do, eat at home. He's not commanding that they must eat common meals or whatever at home, because the statement doesn't appear in a context where he rebukes a common meal. He rebukes the spirit of what they're doing. He rebukes the selfish, self-centered mentality that they had. So he's saying, do you not have houses? If you're going to do all that, do that at home, so that you're not going to be doing that when you observe the Lord's Supper. I mean, if you want to eat and drink and have time, satisfy yourself, if that's so much you're concerned, do that at home. That's what he's saying. He says, or you despise the church of God and shame those who have nothing. And that's what they were doing. When they came together, you can imagine the scenario. Some would get there before others. Travel was much more difficult, we can imagine. Especially the rich probably had better ways of travel. We're doing our best to infer what's going on. And some get there and they get together in their little divided cliques. And they start eating and having a great time. And so before you know it, since they're providing the food for the Lord's Supper, others come who can't afford it and get there late and they don't have anything. Probably not even and the rich may be getting together by themselves, that kind of thing. That's what he's saying. And by doing this kind of thing, you despise the church of God and shame those who have nothing. What shall I say? Shall I praise you? I will not. And so he goes on. I received from the Lord that which I also delivered to you. Now, here's how we know, if for no other reason, that everything he just said, what they were doing was supposed to be the Lord's Supper. Because if this was a matter of some Christians just enjoying food, having a meal, and not really caring, it had nothing to do with the Lord's Supper. Like if I eat breakfast at my house, that's not about the Lord's Supper. If I go to a restaurant, if I go to Mazzio's with my family or some other Christians, it's not about the Lord's Supper. Then there would be no reason for Paul to mention it in connection with the Lord's Supper. There would be no point in him saying, here's what the Lord did. Because obviously what they were doing was claimed to be the Lord's Supper. It was a practice that should have been, supposed to be, and they probably even claimed that it was the Lord's Supper. Because it was the practice of Christians to assemble for the Lord's Supper. That's what they were doing, but they were turning it into their own by being selfish and all the self-centeredness that was going on here, and the debauchery. So, that's what was happening. Looking at something here. No. So anyway, if I can get rid of this here. Okay, well, never mind that. Anyway, back to what I was saying. So all the self-centeredness that was happening here was the problem, because it was supposed to be the Lord's Supper. The debauchery, what did I say earlier? But the debauchery happening was just extremely, it was taking something holy and profaning it. I vanished. Sorry about that. Hope you can still hear me, though. But so that's what was happening. And then, so he's saying, here's what I received about the Lord's Supper. Yeah, I vanished. I accidentally when I hit the letter, see, I had to be careful what I'm doing at the screen, typing stuff elsewhere, because I might hit my camera button. That's what happened there. But, he says, in verse 23, for I received from the Lord, I don't know that I'll have time to get to the Israel thing. For I received from the Lord that which I also delivered to you, that the Lord Jesus, in the night in which he was betrayed, took bread. When he had given thanks, he broke it and said, this is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me. In the same way, he took the cup also after supper, saying, this cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this as often as you drink it in remembrance of me. For as often as you eat this bread and drink the cup, you proclaim the death of the Lord until he comes. Now, why does he say this? You can't hear me. Okay, you can hear me. Okay. Yeah, so why does he say this? Now, again, I lost sight of this once upon a time, thinking that, okay, so Paul's correcting the manner in which they were, the ritualistic aspect of what they were doing. This is not a rebuke. The common claim that I was taught is that what they were doing is turning the Lord's Supper into a common meal. And Paul's rebuking them. And then in these verses, he's showing them, here's how you do it. In other words, he's rebuking the form, and then he corrects the form. But that's just not the case. Paul is not rebuking them for turning it into a common meal. He says nothing about the form. He says the self-centeredness is what he's rebuking. The debauchery is what he's rebuking. He says nothing about a common meal. He says nothing about the form in which they keep it. So that is to lose track of what Paul's doing. Whatever else may be said about those kinds of things, or the form, and there's important things to be said about all that, but that's not the point here. He's not correcting the form, nor is he rebuking turning it into a common meal. That is not. He said nothing about turning it into a common meal. The only thing he rebukes is their divisiveness, eating and leaving others hungry, and being another is drunk. And so when you read up to verse 21, you got nothing about a common meal. He's rebuking the self-centeredness of what they were doing. He's rebuking the fact that they were making this about themselves and their own interest instead of the Lord. He says nothing about what they had turned the form into. And when he says, do not have houses to eat and drink in, it was to take care of that problem. So anyway, so in verses 23 through 26, why does he state this? He's trying to remind them of the purpose. This isn't about the form. Now, I'm simply saying this because so many that I've heard for so many years say, this is, he's correcting their form and all this. That's not what this is about at all. Whatever good things may be said about all that from other places, that's not what this is about. The reason he's citing what the Lord did is to refocus them on the purpose. This is about Jesus and remembering him. That's why Paul repeats this twice. This is the only place in the New Testament where Jesus is quoted twice as saying, do this in remembrance of me. In all the other gospel accounts of the Lord's Supper, this is only said once by Jesus. But Paul has Jesus repeating this twice. Do this in remembrance of me. There's a purpose for that, because he's trying to refocus them on the meaning of the Lord's Supper. This is about remembering Christ. And you are all self-centered on your own indulgences and appetites, and you're leaving others hungry. You've lost focus. So he cites what the Lord does to refocus the meaning. Remembering Jesus. And that's why he also adds this at the end. He says, for as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the death of the Lord until he comes. So he's recentering their purpose, or the rightful purpose of the Lord's Supper. And that's what we have to remember. And so I'm also going to say this, which goes along more of what I was saying earlier. Whatever you may as a Christian think about Christmas and Easter, you like it, okay? This is something that you should never lose sight of. The Lord's Supper is much more important. It's an actual ordinance that Jesus instituted and commanded to do in remembrance of him. So whatever you do with Easter and Christmas, and there's other discussions to have about those things that people have all the time. But this is what I want you to know. Whatever you may think about those, do not lose sight of the fact that this is the most important. This is the one that the church came together by divine institution of the apostles and their teaching, the authority of Christ, and instituted in the church what Christ instituted in their midst, which is the Lord's Supper. And I'll say it like this. Whatever you say about Christmas and Easter, if you were to stop celebrating Easter and Christmas, you would be doing no sin, as long as you still honored the Lord and what the Bible says about him. But if you stop remembering him through the Lord's Supper, you have sinned, because you've neglected the very institution that he commanded. Okay, but then he says, therefore, whoever eats this bread and drinks the cup of the Lord in an unworthy manner shall be guilty of the body and the blood of the Lord. Once again, there's a lot of misunderstanding here. Most people seem to think, and I thought this for a long time too, because listen, we're all constantly being educated. I'm always being educated and re-educating myself. That's what we're supposed to do. We're supposed to, as Christians, be humble enough to be able to do that. But so I thought for a long time, and lots of people do, that Paul is saying, when you observe the Lord's Supper, you need to think about how worthy you are. And if you haven't been worthy enough, you shouldn't partake. You're supposed to think, should I really be partaking of this? And I think the Jehovah's Witnesses, this is a big deal for them. I mean, because most of them don't ever partake, because the only ones worthy to partake of the Lord's Supper in the Jehovah's Witnesses are those who consider themselves worthy enough to attain heaven for eternity. You know, the 144,000. There's only 144,000 that are going to attain heaven. The rest are going to be on earth for eternity. And so a lot of that has to do with this as well. But so a lot of people think, you know, I need to think, am I worthy enough to be partaken right now of this? That's not what Paul's talking about. Now, I'm not saying that you shouldn't be contemplating what kind of Christian you've been, or that if you're you're living a double life through the week and you come together, with the church on Sunday and partake of the Lord's Supper, you need to be thinking twice, and 3 times and 4 times. And in fact, you just need to be evaluating things. So I'm not saying there shouldn't be any introspection or self-evaluation. But that's not what Paul's talking about. He's not talking about the individual thinking of how are they worthy as a Christian. Because nobody's going to come to the Lord's Supper on Sunday flawless. I can tell you that right now. We all need mercy. Some more than others. I mean, if you think about it, who is worthy, and how do you define worthy? If that would be the case. That's not what he's talking about. Remember, the context is about them losing sight of this as a memorial for Jesus and seeing it as an opportunity for indulgence and and for their own self-interest. In other words, when he says eating it in an unworthy manner, he means in a way that does not show enough respect for the Lord's death. If you're eating this and you're leaving others hungry because you're indulging and you are well satisfied and you have no honor for the others, if you make it about yourself instead of the Lord, then you're not doing it in a worthy manner. To do this for a reason that doesn't focus upon Jesus is to do it in an unworthy manner. That's why people need to reevaluate reasons they do this. People like to do the Lord's Supper at weddings. A wedding is meant to focus in on the matrimony of 2 people. The wedding is really centered on the bride and groom, and there's nothing wrong with that. Don't do the Lord's Supper at your wedding. You're going to send mixed signals. It's not about the Lord. If you want to get everybody to be contemplating the Lord's death, it's going to be hard to do that when you're celebrating you guys. I mean, it's not about a wedding. It's not about your wedding. So any way that would disrespect the Lord, and certainly that was, but here he's talking to these Christians who were doing it in a way that didn't honor the Lord. This wasn't about them examining themselves, what they did through the week, how good of a Christian they were. This is examining what they were there for. He's saying, what are you there for? Are you observing the Lord's Supper for the Lord, or are you doing this for yourself? With all this self-indulgence and debauchery, that's not worthy to be called the Lord's Supper. That's what he's talking about. And who does it in an unworthy manner shall be guilty of the body and the blood of the Lord. In other words, because you're taking something holy and you're making it profane. So that's the difference. This understanding of these texts that some people have, well, I need to examine myself, how good of a Christian have I been through the week? Oh, that's fine and dandy, but it's not what he's talking about. Because what he's talking about is taking something holy and making it profane because you weren't doing it for the Lord. That's what they were doing. And to do so is to have such a... Here's what the sobering thought of this, The Corinthians, in doing what they were doing, when they made this an opportunity for indulgence and to have fun with their cliques and to disregard the poor among them, they were treating, since this was supposed to be about the Lord's sacrifice, since this was supposed to be about the Lord's death, they were devaluing the Lord's death. They were devaluing his sacrifice, his life. He was killed because this reflects his death. And what they were doing was turning the Lord's Supper into something that devalued his life. That's what murderers do. That's why he says you're going to be guilty of the body and the blood of the Lord. That's sobering. You know, you don't have to think consciously, I don't care about the Lord's death, to be guilty of his murder. You know what murder is? It's just a devaluing of human life. You don't have to hate or despise the person's life. You know, when a man comes up to a stranger and robs them, takes their wallet and shoots them dead to take their money. You know, in these cases where a man was shot dead who didn't, you know, and the man who murdered him didn't even know who he was. He just shot him dead so he could take his money. He didn't have any ill will per se about this person he just killed. He didn't dislike him. He didn't even know him. Didn't have any bad feelings for him. He didn't necessarily think his life means nothing. I will take it from him. He just simply didn't value his life. He didn't value his life to be worth any more than the amount of money that he took from him. So he didn't positively think his life means nothing. He just simply didn't have value for his life. That's what murderers do. That's what he is. So when they were treating the Lord's memorial for a self-indulging opportunity to satisfy themselves and shame others, they were not valuing the Lord's life. It's the same as what the people did who nailed him to the cross. And then he says, but a man must test himself, and in so doing he is to eat of the bread and drink of the cup. But he doesn't mean how good of a Christian have you been. No, test yourself. Why are you doing this? Are you really doing this for the Lord, or are you doing this for yourself? Remember, keep it in context. Follow the train of thought. This is not about evaluating how great of a Christian we've been, even if that's a good thing to do. For he who eats and drinks judgment to himself if he does not judge the body rightly. Why are you doing this? That's the point. Some say that means judge the church rightly. No, I think he means if you're not valuing and putting your focus on the Lord's body that was sacrificed, if this isn't what it's about to you, then you're not looking at it rightly. You're not judging it to be worth anything by the way that you were doing it. By the way they were doing it, they were not estimating and esteeming. That's what it means by judging. They were not putting a value on the Lord's body that was worth what it was. And so they were no different than the people that killed him, guilty of the body and the blood of the Lord. For this reason, many among you are weak and sick, and a number sleep. But if we judge ourselves rightly, we would not be judged. But when we are judged, we are disciplined by the Lord, so we will not be condemned along with the world. You know, these churches that could so easily take the Lord's Supper and they'll make it into something like chips and soda. You know, why would anybody... You could have a discussion about how you are to... You know, people disagree and have debates over, you know, should it have salt? Well, you know, should it be flat? All this... It's easy to know that if your church is making this about Doritos or pizza and soda, it's because they're seeking to make this pleasing and entertaining and delightful and attract people. You're losing sight of what it is. He says, so then, my brothers, when you come together to eat, wait for one another. Now, what he means is, we see that when they were coming together at different times, that the food was being eaten before others got there. He's saying, don't do that. Just don't eat. Wait till everybody gets there to eat. If anyone is hungry, let him eat at home, so that you will not come together for judgment. Now, again, if you see this whole section as a condemnation about turning the Lord's Supper into a common meal, or a condemnation that you can't eat any kind of meal as a church other than the Lord's Supper, you will cite that line too. You see, Paul says, if any man's hungry, let him eat at home. Because you're only supposed to eat for hunger's sake, they say, at home. I've heard people say that. And why am I bringing this up? Because all this distracts from what the text is actually about. What he says right there, if you're hungry and you want to eat for hunger's sake, eat at home. Why does he say that, though? He didn't say anywhere that it was wrong to eat some other kind of meal as a church. He never said that. The reason he says that is because of what they were doing. You see, Paul is trying to give them a solution for the problem. In other words, if you're hungry, they were already so hungry and they were eating that they weren't leaving other food for other people. And he's saying, if you can't control yourselves, eat before you get there. Eat at home. If you're that hungry, eat at home. So that when you come together, it will not be for judgment by doing what they were doing. That's what it's about. So if you think that this is simply a command thrown in there that you can't eat any kind of meals at church except to be at home, that has to be at home. Notice he says, so that the reason you eat at home if you're hungry is that you will not come together for judgment. But what if the church comes together and doesn't do those bad things that he rebukes? What if they come together for a common meal and are not self-centered and overindulgent, and they are sharing? Then they wouldn't come together for judgment if they did come together to eat. The reason they are told to eat at home is because in their case, it would solve the problem. They wouldn't come together so hungry that they would be doing the things that they're doing. And so this is not about turning it into a common meal. That's not even the issue. The issue is the reason that they were even doing the Lord's Supper, and the overindulgence and self-interest and selfishness. That's the point. Now, so I've read through all that, and I'm simply wanting us to focus in on the Lord's Supper. Now, undoubtedly, someone will say, well, why didn't you talk about this? Yeah, I don't blame you. There's the Lord's Supper, for better or for worse, and probably for worse. Let me say it like this. There's more debate and disagreement on the Lord's Supper than there is baptism, and there's plenty on baptism. There's all kinds of disagreements and issues. And, it's like, which controversy do you pick to talk about? I just wanted to look at the passage, show what the Lord's Supper is about. It's about the Lord's memorial, and it should always stay that way, and it's more important than any other holy day or holiday that people could have or engage in when it comes to Jesus. More important than any of them. But, all these other issues, what isn't? That's the easier question to ask. What isn't debated? And listen, there's a good place to have the debates. Because it's an important ordinance. I'm just simply saying I can't talk about all of them. How frequently it is observed is debated. How regular it is, or what day it should be observed on, is debated. The ingredients are debated. Wine or grape juice is debated. Whether it becomes the real body and blood of Jesus, transubstantiation is debated. Who can partake of it? So someone did ask, what do you think of unbelievers partaking of it? Well, practically that is very difficult. It is clearly an observance meant for the Lord's people. It has no meaning for someone who's not a member. This is a unity, and that goes back to 1 Corinthians 10, in fact. All partaking of the Lord's Supper shows a unity among them. So it has no meaning for the unbelievers. And so some do practice closed communion. Now, I'm not sure how that worked itself out in the early church. The early church talks about, in 1 Corinthians 14, it talks about unbelievers and visitors coming into the church. So they were welcomed. So the assemblies did have unbelievers coming in. And I don't know of a scenario where you can exclude them while you say, hey, all right, well, we're going to go as a church, eat the Lord's Supper, but you can't partake. That's a very difficult, and I'm not sure I figured out the answer to that. If you're going to practice closed communion, I get it. It's for the Lord's Supper. From what I understand, John Calvin back in the day would stand at the table with the sword drawn. And so people do it. There are churches that invite people to the Lord's Supper, but when you come up to the table or whatever it is, they'll say, are you a member? It can be done, I suppose. you really got to think about it, because in one hand, the Scripture does recognize the church has to be inviting. People coming into your assembly. They need to be edified by coming in there. Unbelievers, it mentions specifically. And then if you separate from them and say, now we're going to go do this, you can't come. You got to be very wise to do it. And so if a church practices closed communion, I get it. I mean, I'd like to know how you do it. Because I've seen my own experience, I've seen people storm away because they weren't offered the Lord's Supper when it came around, because they weren't members. And boy, did they get mad and never came back, as far as I know. I've seen it more than once. Now, I'm not saying that determines how you do it. I'm just simply saying, the Bible doesn't speak specifically about allowing unbelievers in. And so wisdom has to be applied, and it has to be applied very carefully. So, and I'll say this, if you're going to practice closed communion, you should practice closed collection. If you don't let unbelievers participate, okay, fine, and you've done it in a wise and non-offensive way, good. Make sure you communicate the same about them giving. You don't want visitors coming, allowing them to pitch in and give money into the basket, but then say, well, but we can't let you do the Lord's Supper. You need to be consistent, I say, with both of those. I think it has to be left to the each congregation to decide how to do that. I think what I would do is whoever is leading the Lord's Supper when it starts. If you got people in there that probably aren't believers, or aren't believers, and when your church is large enough, a lot of times this could be always the case, at least state things like, this is a supper for Christians, those who have given themselves to the Lord, to show unity of Christians. And perhaps you then have made it clear that this is supposed to be a memorial of unity for Christians. At least you've said what needs to be said anyway. So anyway, I'm going to change the title because I didn't get to the Israel thing. I thought I didn't want to go too long here. I do appreciate everybody coming in. I appreciate everybody in the side chat. And things to remember. Mockery and filth at the ceremony, and that's unfortunate. Lord's Supper is important. Thanks, everybody. Good night and God bless.